In December 1941, the Pacific was on fire. Japan had struck at Pearl Harbor and launched a series of rapid invasions across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. American forces were spread thin and unprepared for the speed and force of the Japanese advance. In the Philippines, on the Bataan Peninsula, and later on Guadalcanal, American and Filipino troops tried to slow the enemy's progress. These early battles were marked by confusion, desperation, and fierce fighting in jungles, mountains, and along beaches. The Japanese Imperial Army entered these fights with confidence. They had already swept through territories using their standard infantry rifles, the Arisaka Type 38 and Type 99. These were bolt-action rifles, sturdy and reliable. Each held 5 rounds in a magazine, loaded using stripper clips. To fire, the soldier aimed, pulled the trigger, then lifted and pulled back the bolt to eject the spent cartridge before pushing it forward to load the next round. It was a well-practiced motion but always slowed the rate of fire. In combat, a trained Japanese soldier could fire about 15 aimed shots per minute. The Japanese believed their bolt-action rifles were equal or superior to anything the enemy might field. They expected American infantry to fight with similar weapons. But in these early clashes, they encountered something new and unexpected. The American troops were armed with the M1 Garand, a semi-automatic rifle unlike anything the Japanese had faced before. The M1 held 8 rounds in an en-bloc clip and automatically ejected each spent casing. A soldier only had to pull the trigger each time he wanted to fire. The action cycled on its own, ready for the next shot immediately. This gave a single rifleman the ability to fire 30 to 40 aimed shots per minute, more than twice the rate of a bolt-action rifle. The difference was dramatic in combat. When Japanese units advanced expecting the usual rhythm of battle, they were caught off guard. They anticipated short bursts of fire followed by pauses as the enemy worked their bolts and reloaded. Instead, they ran into a wall of constant, hammering gunfire. The sound of the M1 Garand was different. It was faster, more continuous, and gave the impression of a much larger force. When a clip was emptied, it ejected with a distinctive metallic ping. A fresh clip was slammed in almost instantly, and firing resumed without a real pause. Japanese soldiers found themselves under relentless pressure, unable to move or regroup without taking heavy losses. On the ground, the effect was chaos. Japanese squads advanced through jungle paths or across open ground, moving in tight formations and shouting to keep their morale high. When the first shots came from the American side, they expected to find windows of opportunity to rush forward between enemy volleys. Instead, they were pinned down by streams of fire that never seemed to stop. A Japanese rifleman had to work his bolt after every shot, a motion that cost him precious seconds. Those seconds often meant the difference between life and death. As the casualties mounted, panic set in. Officers tried to rally their men, shouting orders and signaling for flanking maneuvers. But the pace of the American fire made even simple movements dangerous. American soldiers fought with growing confidence. They knew their rifles gave them a clear advantage. A squad of American infantry could hold its position against a larger force because each man's rifle produced more firepower than 2 or 3 enemy soldiers combined. The Garand allowed them to lay down continuous suppressive fire without relying heavily on machine guns. In small unit engagements, this was decisive. At places like Patton, American units were often outnumbered and cut off from supplies, but their rifles helped them exact a heavy toll on attacking Japanese forces. The first Japanese reports back to higher command described these rifles as strange automatic weapons. Soldiers wrote of battles where they believed they were facing machine guns, only to later discover it had been ordinary riflemen. This caused confusion at the command level, as Japanese planners struggled to understand how their troops were being stopped so effectively. They initially underestimated the impact of the M1 Garand, assuming it was rare or confined to elite units. As more encounters occurred, it became clear that this weapon was standard issue for American infantry. The realization was unsettling. The Japanese army had no equivalent weapon in widespread service, and developing one in the middle of a global war was no simple task. The tactical consequences showed quickly. Japanese units began to change how they attacked. Bayonet charges became more common, with the hope of closing the distance before the Americans could bring their superior firepower to bear. Night attacks were increased, using darkness to reduce the advantage of the Garands' rapid fire. Even with these changes, the M1 continued to tip the balance in firefights. The sheer volume of fire it delivered disrupted traditional Japanese tactics and forced their soldiers to fight under constant pressure. As these battles unfolded, the human side of the conflict came into sharp focus. Japanese soldiers were trained to be fearless and disciplined, but even the best training could not fully prepare them for a weapon they had never seen before. Some accounts describe their shock and disbelief in the aftermath of these early encounters. For American soldiers, the M1 Garand inspired trust. Many credited it with saving their lives. They learned to count on its reliability, even in mud, rain, and the rough conditions of jungle warfare. A sense of pride grew around the rifle. General George S. Patton would later call it the greatest battle implement ever devised, a statement that reflected how central it had become to the American war effort. These early clashes in the Pacific set the tone for the campaigns to come. They showed that technology at the individual soldier level could shape the course of battles. In the jungles of the Pacific, where engagements were often fought by small groups of men at close range, the difference between a bolt-action rifle and a semi-automatic was more than technical. It was the difference between holding a line and being overrun. The Japanese had entered the war confident in their skill and courage. The first encounters with the M1 Garand forced them to confront a new reality. Their enemy had a weapon that could fire twice as fast and change the very rhythm of battle. The standard Japanese infantry rifle at the start of the Pacific War was the Arisaka, a bolt-action weapon that came in two main versions, the older Type 38 and the newer Type 99. These rifles were built to be rugged and reliable. They were accurate and could handle rough handling in the field. Each rifle held 5 rounds of ammunition, loaded by inserting a stripper clip into the top of the open action. After firing, the soldier had to lift the bolt handle, pull it back to eject the spent cartridge, then push it forward and lock it down to chamber the next round. This was a smooth motion for a trained soldier, but it always slowed the rate of fire. In ideal conditions, a skilled marksman could fire about 15 aim shots in 1 minute. In combat, where adrenaline, fatigue, and incoming fire were factors, the rate was usually even lower. The Arisaka design had several strengths. It was simple, durable, and could stand up to mud, rain, and the harsh environments of the Pacific Islands. The cartridges it fired were powerful and had good range, which suited open terrain and defensive positions. The Japanese military had used bolt-action rifles like this for decades, and their tactics were built around that style of weapon. Units trained to fire in coordinated volleys, to maneuver between periods of shooting, and to close with the enemy for bayonet charges when possible. This rhythm of combat had worked well against opponents with similar equipment. At the time, the Japanese soldiers had every reason to believe their rifles were as good as anything they would face. The American M1 Garand changed that equation completely. It looked like a traditional rifle at first glance, with a wooden stock and metal barrel, but its internal mechanism was very different. The M1 was a semi-automatic rifle. Instead of cycling the bolt by hand, the rifle used the gas from each fired round to automatically eject the empty casing and chamber the next round. The soldier only had to pull the trigger each time he wanted to fire. This meant there was no pause between shots, no extra motion to work the bolt, and no break in aim while reloading a single round. The rifle was always ready for the next shot as soon as the trigger was released. The M1 Garand was fed by an 8-round N-block clip. This metal clip was inserted directly into the rifle's internal magazine, and it stayed in place while the rounds were fired. When the last round was shot, the clip was automatically ejected with a sharp metallic ping. A new clip could be inserted immediately, and firing could resume almost without pause. This design allowed American soldiers to maintain a steady, uninterrupted rate of fire. In practice, a well-trained rifleman could deliver 30 to 40 accurate shots per minute, more than double the output of a bolt-action rifle like the Arisaka. The difference between 15 and 40 shots per minute might sound like a matter of numbers, but in battle it had a dramatic effect. A Japanese squad firing bolt-action rifles had to work together to create enough volume of fire to suppress an enemy. Each soldier was limited by the time it took to cycle the bolt and reload after 5 shots. During those pauses, their firepower dropped. The American squad, equipped with M1 Garands, did not have that limitation. Every man could keep firing almost continuously, reloading quickly when needed, and then returning to action without breaking the overall tempo. Even without machine guns, an American unit could generate the kind of firepower that normally required heavier weapons. This constant stream of shots had a psychological effect as well as a tactical one. Japanese troops were used to the rhythm of traditional rifle fire, with bursts followed by clear gaps. They expected to hear pauses that gave them a chance to move forward or reposition. When they faced the M1 Garand for the first time, they heard instead a rapid, unending series of shots. It sounded like many more soldiers than were actually present. Some Japanese reports from these early encounters described the impression of facing a line of automatic weapons. Soldiers wrote of being pinned down by what they thought was multiple machine guns, only to later discover it had been ordinary riflemen. This illusion caused confusion and fear, which disrupted their usual aggressive tactics. The mechanical speed of the M1 meant that Americans could maintain pressure on the enemy throughout an entire engagement. In a defensive position, they could repel assaults with steady, overwhelming fire. In an attack, they could move forward while still firing effectively, suppressing defenders before they had a chance to respond. Japanese bolt-action rifles were accurate, but they could not match that tempo. Even when a Japanese soldier aimed well and fired quickly, he could not overcome the physical limit of working the bolt and reloading 5-round clips under stress. The difference showed itself most clearly when comparing squad-level engagements. Consider a group of 10 Japanese soldiers firing Arisakas. At best, together they might produce 150 shots in a minute if everyone fired at top speed without error or interruption. In the same time, 10 American soldiers with M1 Garands could deliver 300 to 400 shots. That meant the Americans could project more than twice the firepower with the same number of men. In close-quarters fighting, this could mean the difference between holding a position and being forced to retreat. The design of the M1 Garand also reduced fatigue. Operating a bolt repeatedly under stress was physically tiring, especially during long battles. The semi-automatic action of the M1 let soldiers focus on aiming and movement rather than mechanical operation. Over the course of hours or days, this gave American troops an endurance advantage. They could stay in the fight longer and respond faster to sudden threats. This technological gap forced changes on the battlefield. Japanese officers noticed that their men were taking heavy casualties when attacking American positions head-on. The speed and density of M1 fire made traditional assault tactics ineffective. To adapt, they increased their use of night attacks and close-range ambushes, hoping to neutralize the Americans' firepower advantage by fighting at distances where volume of fire mattered less. Despite these adjustments, the basic problem remained. The M1 Garand gave each American soldier the firepower of 2 or more opponents, and it did so with reliability and ease of use that matched the rugged conditions of the Pacific War. In the early months of the conflict, the shock of encountering this weapon shaped the way battles unfolded. For the Japanese, it was a rude surprise. For the Americans, it was a source of growing confidence. The technical differences between the Arisaka and the M1 Garand were not just matters of design. They shaped tactics, morale, and outcomes in a way that every soldier on the battlefield could see and feel. The jungle was thick with heat and the smell of mud. A Japanese infantry squad moved carefully along a narrow trail, their rifles held at the ready. The men were silent except for the crunch of boots and the low rasp of breath. They had been told the enemy ahead was tired, undersupplied, and using rifles no better than their own. Their orders were clear: push forward, break the American line, and keep advancing before reinforcements could arrive. The squad leader raised his hand, and the men dropped to one knee. They scanned the trees, searching for signs of movement. Nothing stirred. The leader gave a short command, and the squad rose again. They moved with confidence. In past battles, they had relied on their discipline and the steady rhythm of their bolt-action rifles. They knew the pace of battle, the moments when their opponents would pause to reload. They believed they understood what was waiting for them. Up ahead, concealed behind fallen logs and makeshift barricades, American soldiers waited in silence. Their rifles were loaded, safeties off. The M1 Garands rested on shoulders and knees, 8-round clips ready to fire. These men had been in combat for days, holding the line against repeated attacks. They knew the Japanese were coming, and they were ready. The first shot cracked through the jungle. A Japanese soldier fell, and the squad froze for a split second before returning fire. They expected a brief exchange followed by a pause. Instead, a storm of bullets erupted from the American position. The fire did not stop. The Japanese fired their Arisakas, each man working his bolt in a smooth, practiced motion. After each shot, they had to lift, pull, push, and lock before they could aim and fire again. It was a familiar cycle, but under the hail of incoming rounds, it felt impossibly slow. A man fired and ducked. He worked the bolt, then rose again to aim, only to be struck before he could pull the trigger. The Americans did not pause. Their semi-automatic rifles spat round after round with a steady, relentless rhythm. Each trigger pull sent another bullet downrange. Spent casings flew through the air, clinking as they hit the ground. The Japanese soldiers expected to hear gaps, the natural breaks in the fight when their enemy would reload. Instead, they heard nothing but continuous fire. It sounded like machine guns, like an entire company firing at once. A Japanese officer shouted over the noise, waving his sword and pointing toward the flank. His voice was nearly drowned out by the gunfire. He tried to rally his men, urging them to press forward. A few soldiers obeyed, charging through the underbrush with bayonets fixed. They were cut down almost instantly. In the chaos, the rhythm of the Japanese rifles broke apart. Some men managed to fire 2 or 3 shots before their 5-round magazines ran dry. They fumbled for stripper clips, fingers slick with sweat and mud. Every second they spent reloading was a second under the Americans' unbroken fire. One man jammed his clip and cursed, then fell backward as a bullet struck him in the chest. The camera would slow here, showing the contrast in sharp detail. A Japanese rifleman pulls back his bolt in desperate haste, his face tense. Across the battlefield, an American soldier ejects an empty clip with a sharp metallic ping. Almost instantly, a fresh clip is slammed into place, and the rifle resumes firing without hesitation. The Japanese squad's cohesion began to crumble. Soldiers shouted to one another, unsure of where to move. Some tried to retreat, crawling backward through the jungle brush. Others stayed low, trapped by the sheer volume of fire sweeping across their position. The officer yelled again, but his words were lost in the storm of noise. The Americans advanced slowly, firing as they moved. Their rifles kept up the same unbroken tempo, a wall of sound and lead pushing the enemy back. The Japanese tried to hold their ground, but each time they rose to fire, another volley cut them down. The sense of shock spread through the surviving men. This was not the battle they had prepared for. Their training told them when to expect pauses, when to rush forward. Now there were no pauses, only constant, crushing firepower. As the fight dragged on, the Japanese line broke completely. Small groups fled into the trees, leaving behind their dead and wounded. The officer tried to rally a final stand but was forced to withdraw when it became clear that staying meant annihilation. When the gunfire finally slowed, the jungle was silent except for the cries of the wounded and the occasional metallic ping of an empty clip ejecting. The ground was littered with spent casings, broken rifles, and fallen men. The Americans regrouped, checking their weapons and reloading, ready in case of another attack. This battle was one of many during the early months of the war, but it revealed a truth that would repeat itself across the Pacific. The M1 Garand gave American infantry a decisive edge. In the hands of trained soldiers, it allowed a small group to hold against larger numbers. The Japanese soldiers, brave and disciplined, were forced to fight under conditions they had never experienced. Their bolt-action rifles simply could not match the pace of the semi-automatic fire. The jungle swallowed the retreating Japanese squad as night fell. For the men who had faced the M1 Garand that day, the memory of its unending fire would stay with them. They had walked into battle expecting an even fight and had instead encountered a weapon that changed the rules in an instant. The first encounters with the M1 Garand left deep marks on both sides of the fighting. Japanese soldiers went into battle with confidence, believing their training, discipline, and bolt-action rifles would match anything the enemy could bring. In earlier campaigns across China and Southeast Asia, their Arisaka rifles had proven reliable and accurate. They trusted them. But when they faced the Americans in the jungles and beaches of the Pacific, that trust began to falter. The shock came in the form of sound and speed. Survivors of those first battles later wrote of their confusion. They had expected to hear single shots followed by the familiar rhythm of reloading. Instead, they heard a constant roar of rifle fire that never seemed to pause. It sounded, they said, like a line of machine guns. Some soldiers thought they were being ambushed by a much larger force. When the fight was over and they examined captured weapons, the truth unsettled them even more. These were not machine guns. They were rifles issued to ordinary infantrymen. One Japanese corporal described the experience in his diary. His unit had attacked a small American position on a jungle trail. At first, they advanced with confidence. Then, without warning, they were pinned down by what he called strange rifles that fired without end. He wrote that his comrades could not understand how so many shots came so quickly. Several men were hit while they were still working the bolts of their Arisakas. The corporal survived by crawling into a muddy ditch and waiting for darkness to retreat. He ended his account with a single line, "We were outgunned by a weapon unlike any other." As more reports reached Japanese command, officers began to realize they faced a new challenge. Patrol leaders described a weapon that allowed every American soldier to fire at the speed of a light machine gun. Messages sent up the chain used words like automatic rifle. Though technically the M1 was semi-automatic, the distinction was lost in the chaos of battle. What mattered to those in the field was simple. The Americans could shoot faster, reload faster, and keep shooting without pause. This realization weighed heavily on morale. Japanese infantry tactics relied on sudden charges and bold movements to close the distance with the enemy. These tactics depended on timing and the ability to predict when the enemy would stop firing to reload. Against the M1, that timing vanished. Soldiers began to hesitate, even when ordered to attack. The fear of facing the endless fire of the Garands slowed their movements and made coordinated assaults harder to execute. Some soldiers started carrying extra grenades or relying more on night attacks, hoping to avoid direct firefights. For American soldiers, the reaction was very different. Many of them were young and inexperienced when they first entered combat. The M1 Garand gave them a weapon they could rely on, even when outnumbered. In the confusion of jungle warfare, the ability to fire quickly and accurately brought a sense of security. Veterans later recalled the relief they felt knowing they had a rifle that would not fail them. Private Charles Riley, who fought in the Philippines, described his first battle with the M1. His unit was dug in when a Japanese assault began. At first, he was terrified. Then he realized he could fire as fast as he needed to without breaking his aim. He remembered the sound of his rifle cycling smoothly, shot after shot. "It felt like the rifle was part of me," he said years later. "I didn't have to think about the mechanics. I just kept firing and reloading, and it kept me alive." The confidence inspired by the Garand spread through American ranks. Soldiers took pride in their rifles, calling them the advantage or the edge. Some joked that a single American squad could sound like an entire platoon thanks to the volume of fire their rifles produced. Officers noticed the boost in morale. They saw how quickly new recruits gained trust in the weapon, even in harsh conditions where mud and rain jammed other firearms. General George S. Patton famously praised the M1 Garand, calling it the greatest battle implement ever devised. His words reflected not just its technical merits but also its impact on the spirit of the troops. It was a rifle that could be counted on, one that gave soldiers a psychological advantage before the first shot was even fired. The contrast between the two sides was stark. Japanese soldiers, disciplined and brave, now faced a weapon that disrupted their expectations and eroded their confidence. Americans, often facing larger enemy forces, found in the M1 a reason to believe they could hold the line. The weapon's reliability created a bond of trust between soldier and rifle. As the war went on, these human reactions shaped the fighting as much as strategy or supply lines. In countless small battles, the fear and hesitation of one side met the growing confidence of the other. Diaries, letters, and memories tell the story of men grappling with the reality of a weapon that changed their world. For the Japanese, it was disbelief turned to dread. For the Americans, it was pride born of survival and victory. In the dense jungles, on narrow beaches, and across rocky ridges, the sound of the M1 Garand became part of the landscape of war. To those who fought with it or against it, that sound carried more than bullets. It carried fear, hope, and the hard truth that technology could tip the balance of battle in a single, decisive moment. When the first clashes between American and Japanese forces unfolded in the Pacific, the advantage provided by the M1 Garand was clear to the soldiers on the ground. At first, this difference appeared to be only a matter of individual survival. A single American rifleman could shoot faster and reload quicker than his Japanese opponent. But as the fighting spread across entire islands and campaigns, the impact grew beyond the level of single men and squads. It began to shape the way battles were fought, how strategies were planned, and ultimately, how the war itself unfolded in the Pacific. American infantry squads were built around the firepower of their rifles. In previous wars, most armies relied heavily on machine guns to provide suppressive fire, while rifles filled a supporting role. With the M1 Garand, that balance shifted. Every American soldier could lay down a continuous stream of accurate fire without waiting for orders or the setup of heavy weapons. A squad of 8 to 12 men could now generate firepower that previously required a full section with machine guns. This changed the way units were deployed. Commanders could send smaller groups to hold positions, knowing they would be able to defend themselves against larger enemy forces. In offensive operations, American troops could move forward under their own covering fire, something that had been far more difficult with slower bolt-action rifles. The Japanese military faced a stark disadvantage. Their standard Arisaka rifles were accurate and rugged, but the limited rate of fire meant their infantry had to rely on traditional tactics. Japanese doctrine emphasized aggressive movement and closing the distance quickly. Soldiers were trained to fix bayonets and overwhelm defenders with speed and determination. This approach had worked well in earlier campaigns against opponents who used similar weapons and had lower morale. Against the M1 Garand, these tactics broke down. Whenever Japanese troops attempted to advance, they were met with an unbroken wall of gunfire. The Americans did not have to stop and reload in unison, so there were no openings to exploit. To adapt, Japanese forces shifted their strategy. They increased the use of night attacks, hoping to neutralize the Americans' firepower advantage in the dark. Ambushes became more common, using terrain and surprise to close the distance before sustained rifle fire could pin them down. Bayonet charges were still employed, but now they were often desperate moves rather than planned tactics. Even when these methods worked, they came at a high cost in lives. The Americans could still respond with overwhelming fire once the engagement reached a certain point. The effect of the M1 Garand was especially clear in key battles like Guadalcanal. Early in that campaign, American Marines faced repeated Japanese counterattacks aimed at driving them off the island. The Japanese came in large numbers, often at night, relying on shock and aggression. American units, though outnumbered, held their positions by maintaining constant fire. Survivors of those battles later described the sheer volume of shots fired by defending troops. The Garand allowed them to keep shooting without pause, turning every man into a source of sustained suppression. Japanese assaults that might have succeeded against slower-firing enemies were stopped cold, often with devastating losses. As the war continued, this advantage became systemic. The United States had the industrial capacity to equip every frontline soldier with an M1 Garand. By mid-war, it was the standard weapon across the Pacific. Even units far from major supply hubs received them in large numbers. This uniformity mattered. Not only did every American squad have the same level of firepower, but logistics were simpler, and training was streamlined. Soldiers rotated into combat already familiar with the weapon, and replacements could step into the line without needing to learn a new system. The Japanese, in contrast, struggled to match this level of production. Late in the war, they began developing their own semi-automatic rifles, such as prototypes based on captured American weapons. But these efforts came too late and in numbers far too small to influence the outcome. For most of the conflict, Japanese infantry fought with weapons designed for a different era, while their opponents were armed with what was, at the time, the most advanced service rifle in the world. The difference in small arms also affected the planning of larger operations. American commanders learned that they could assault fortified positions with fewer machine guns and fewer men overall because their basic infantry squads carried so much inherent firepower. This freed up heavier weapons for specialized roles and gave the Americans more flexibility. Amphibious landings, such as those at Tarawa and later at Saipan, relied heavily on the ability of small units to fight independently once they hit the beach. Each man's Garand played a role in that success. In contrast, Japanese defenders often found themselves outgunned even when they held strong positions. Their rifles could not match the suppressive effect of the American fire, and their machine guns were too few to compensate. The psychological impact of this imbalance was just as important as the tactical effect. American troops went into battle knowing they had a weapon advantage. That confidence shaped their willingness to take risks and press attacks. Japanese troops, meanwhile, faced the demoralizing reality of being consistently outgunned. Even when they fought bravely and skillfully, they knew their rifles could not match the enemy's. This erosion of morale made it harder to maintain the aggressive spirit that had been a hallmark of Japanese infantry doctrine. By the time the later campaigns began, the M1 Garand was no longer a surprise. The Japanese understood its capabilities and had adapted as best they could. But the fundamental imbalance remained. In battle after battle, the same pattern repeated itself. American squads holding ground against larger forces, advancing under their own fire, and delivering devastating volleys that the enemy could not match. A single technological edge had grown into a decisive operational advantage, reshaping the way the war was fought across the Pacific Islands. When the war ended, the impact of the M1 Garand did not fade. Soldiers who had fought with it carried home memories of a weapon that had saved their lives and shaped their battles. In the years that followed, the rifle became a symbol of American military strength. It was not just another piece of equipment. It was remembered as a turning point in the way wars were fought. Veterans spoke of its reliability and the sense of confidence it gave them. Many credited it with giving small units the power to stand their ground against overwhelming numbers. In the United States, the M1 Garand was celebrated as a national achievement. It had been designed before the war and mass-produced at a scale that seemed impossible at the time. By the end of the conflict, millions had been built and issued. Soldiers who had fought in Europe and the Pacific praised its ruggedness. Museums and memorials displayed it alongside the stories of the men who carried it. Collectors and historians preserved examples, keeping alive the connection to the soldiers who had relied on it during the hardest days of the war. Even today, its distinct metallic ping, the sound of the empty clip ejecting, remains instantly recognizable to those who study military history. It has become part of the cultural memory of the Second World War, as familiar as the images of landing craft and jungle firefights. The legacy of the M1 Garand extended beyond symbolism. Its success changed how militaries around the world thought about infantry weapons. Before the war, most armies still relied on bolt-action rifles, a design that had changed little since World War I. The performance of the Garand proved that semi-automatic rifles gave ordinary soldiers far greater battlefield effectiveness. Other nations took note. In the post-war years, armies everywhere began developing their own semi-automatic and automatic rifles. The lessons learned in the Pacific and European theaters drove the transition toward modern assault rifles like the M14, the FNFAL, and later the M16 and AK-47. Japan, devastated by the war and under Allied occupation, faced the challenge of rebuilding its military from the ground up. The experience of fighting against the M1 Garand shaped their decisions. They adopted newer designs that incorporated semi-automatic and eventually fully automatic capabilities. The Arisaka rifles that had served them for decades were finally retired, relics of an older way of fighting. The change marked not just a shift in equipment, but also a recognition that future wars would be won by giving every soldier rapid, reliable firepower. Modern military planners continued to study the Pacific campaigns for insights. The battles had shown that infantry firepower could shape tactics and outcomes as much as tanks or artillery. In many engagements, the presence of M1 Garands had allowed American units to fight independently and maneuver flexibly. This influenced later doctrines that emphasized small, mobile squads rather than tightly packed formations. The Garands' impact was not only technological but also psychological. A soldier armed with a superior weapon fought with more confidence, while an enemy facing that weapon often hesitated. That edge in morale could be as decisive as the rifle's mechanical advantages. Over the decades, the M1 Garand remained a fixture in ceremonies and historical reenactments. It appeared in films, documentaries, and books about the war. Veterans passed down stories of the rifle to younger generations, describing how it felt to carry one into battle. Many recalled the sound it made when a clip ejected, a sharp note that signaled both the need to reload and the promise of more fire to come. That sound, simple and mechanical, became one of the most enduring symbols of the American soldier's experience in World War II. The rifle also became a collector's item. Surplus Garands were sold to civilians, and shooting clubs sprang up to preserve the skills of those who had trained with it. Military museums across the world displayed examples alongside captured Arisaka rifles, often placing them side by side to illustrate the stark contrast between the two weapons. Visitors could see for themselves the difference that had been felt so keenly on the battlefield. In military academies, the story of the Garand is still taught. It serves as an example of how innovation at the level of a single soldier's weapon can ripple outward to affect entire campaigns. It also highlights the importance of logistics and production. The rifle's success was not only a matter of design, but of the United States' ability to manufacture and distribute millions of them across multiple theaters of war. The M1 Garand's legacy is more than a chapter in history books. It represents a moment when technology shifted the balance of power in combat. The clash between American semi-automatic rifles and Japanese bolt-action rifles was more than a comparison of two pieces of steel and wood. It was a meeting of two eras. For the men who fought, it was immediate and personal. For future generations, it became a lesson in how preparation, design, and industrial might can shape the outcome of war. Today, when historians describe the turning points of the Pacific conflict, they often return to the image of a soldier crouched behind cover, his Garand cycling smoothly as he fires. They recall the stories of Japanese soldiers stunned by the speed and volume of that fire, and of American troops who trusted their rifles as they advanced through jungle and surf. The weapon's distinctive sound still echoes in documentaries and ceremonies, a reminder of a time when a simple mechanical advantage helped change the course of history.